Good morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Serve Pro. Obviously getting closer to that game for Georgia against Alabama. Key update on Georgia injuries. We'll tell you about that on the show here today. Perhaps a little bit of evidence that maybe some of the stuff that we did yesterday, trying to stir the pot, fan the flames, generate the hysteria around all the, not man enough stuff, the kind of reintroduce that old school criticism here to see if we can get Georgia in the right frame of mind. We perhaps have some evidence today that maybe that's working, at least as we kind of hope that it would. We'll tell you about that here today. Also, maybe some evidence that Alabama is somehow trying to do the same thing. We'll have to be fair and balanced and give you some of that information on the show here today, too. But to kick things off and to begin, there was one question yesterday that Kirby Smart had no interest in answering. And so he essentially just sort of dodged it. But we feel like we are capable of answering it for him. So that's what we're going to do. What is that one question that Kirby Smart didn't want to touch yesterday? We'll play you his response here in a moment and tell you everything you need to know. And we're glad to have you with us as we get rolling today. That plus Connor Riley stops by as well. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Serve Pro. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Serve Pro. Cleaning, restoration, construction.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
We made a very big deal on yesterday's show and a little bit on Friday there, too, about, hey, can we get, the vibe going here, the energy, some feistiness among Georgia fans, and perhaps the team itself feeding off that, about what seems to be, a level of skepticism about Georgia out there right now, and media types kind of falling into old habits and just sort of knee-jerk reaction praise of Alabama prior to Saturday's game. Can we create one of these, really ornery vibes, to use, an old-timey Western word, ornery vibes that has seemed to serve Georgia well? We have tried to do our part on that. Well, coming up in a couple of minutes, I have at least a small piece of evidence that what we've been trying to do perhaps has been working. I'll tell you what we know about that today here in just a moment. Prior to that, though, let me begin this way. A lot sometimes gets made of Kirby Smart's relationship with the media. Speaking of ornery, we certainly have seen Kirby be ornery with the media before, maybe sometimes for good reasons, maybe sometimes not, but, ultimately his prerogative to decide how he wants to act in his press conferences. And Kirby, at times, doesn't always seem to love being there. The old line from the NFL about, I'm just here so I don't get fined. Sometimes it sort of seems like that's kind of Kirby's approach to some of this kind of stuff. However, here's one thing that I've noticed, and perhaps you've noticed this too, is that while at times Kirby Smart might not be the most media-friendly coach of all time, I would say that Kirby Smart is pretty media-savvy. In other words, he may act like he doesn't have any time for the media, but he at times does seem to have a little bit of a strategy for how he handles the media. And one way in which I feel like I've noticed that, perhaps you've seen this too, is that Smart, from his perspective, is very good at recognizing a potential narrative and doing everything he can to sort of sidestep that narrative before it becomes a thing. And he does this not by certainly leaning into it and granting the premise of questions and then answering those questions, but he also sometimes doesn't really push back against the narrative either. Sometimes he will do what I think of as just sort of playing dead. In other words, he just sort of gives you a nothing, blob of an answer that doesn't really fit into the quote that you might be trying to use in your story, or someone like me might be trying to use as a clip on a show, that if he sort of senses a narrative is coming, he just kind of goes into a shell and just almost gives you less than nothing on something like that. I think we had a little bit of an example of this yesterday. Smart was asked what I think is a pretty interesting question, but it's almost a question that's so interesting, Smart already knows. He doesn't have any intention of wanting to answer it. In fact, it may be the one thing about Alabama, this opponent in particular, that Smart does not want to talk about. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to play Smart's answer to this question, and since Kirby doesn't want to answer this, we ourselves are going to try to answer it for him, at least from the way that we would view Georgia football here right now. This is what the question is, and then I'll play the response for you. The question is simply this: what would it mean for Kirby to beat Alabama? And there's a lot of reasons why this question matters. It's the only team in recent years that's beaten Georgia. It's the place where Kirby Smart used to work. It's a new era for the Crimson Tide with Nick Saban no longer being there. There are a lot of different reasons why this question could be potentially interesting. But it's also so obviously interesting that Kirby knows better, at least in his own mind. He knows better than to play along with any of this. So let me let you hear Kirby Smart sort of avoiding the topic yesterday when asked directly, what would it mean for you to beat Alabama? This is what Kirby Smart said.
It mean we got to get ready for Auburn. It's really that simple, guys. It's a conference schedule game. It's going to be really tough environment on the road, which sounds like a broken record because the last one we were talking about was a tough environment on the road. And win or lose, the next one's going to be really hard, and the next one's going to be really hard, and the next one's going to be really hard. They all are hard. And in our league, in our conference, you see it every week. It's tough. It's physical. So we got to have a great week of preparation. They got a tremendous team. Nothing but respect for Kalen DeBoer and what he's done with that team and that staff. I think he's done a great job of putting them in a position to grow and get better. And they've gotten better with each game. So we need to do the same this week.
So that's an answer from Kirby Smart, but it's mostly not the answer to the question that was asked. Now, I think most Georgia fans are probably fine with that. They'd rather Kirby be working hard behind the scenes to beat Alabama than to sit there and talk about why it would be important to beat Alabama. A lot of Georgia fans sort of feel like they may already know the answer to that question. They may not feel like they need Kirby Smart to say that, but it is still at least somewhat interesting that Smart, recognizing the natural curiosity that might exist around that topic, and then choosing not to play into it. But because we talk for a living, of course, we're going to talk about stuff like this. And let me tell you what the game, I think, for Georgia means on Saturday, what it would mean to beat Alabama, by starting with what it doesn't mean. And this is one of those things that almost every Alabama fan, I believe, misunderstands. And certainly a good number of Georgia fans misunderstand, too. There's this belief that there's extra pressure on Georgia on Saturday because Alabama has beaten Georgia before, and that there's this somehow mystique that must be conquered, as if the uniform, the sort of bland and blah crimson and cream, somehow has some sort of special power over Georgia. Obviously, most of us are smart enough to recognize that is superstitious nonsense, that Alabama in the past has had success against Georgia because it had a great coach and it's had great players. And we'll find out on Saturday if this version of Alabama matches the standard that previous Alabama teams have had. But the aura around Alabama alone has never been enough to beat Georgia, nor will it be enough to beat Georgia on Saturday. That's just absurd to even think about it in those terms, that somehow there's a hex on Kirby from Alabama or some sort of extra mental hurdle in a game like this. Simply don't buy that as an issue. And the one thing that Alabama fans, and I'm sure there are plenty in our comment section right now who might say something like this, they certainly say this to me on social media. Many of them say this to you too. Yeah, but it's 1-5. Isn't that the number? 1-5. That's Kirby Smart's record against Nick Saban, while Nick Saban was the Alabama coach, since Kirby Smart has been a head coach here at UGA. And I know a lot of Alabama people think, well, that is the ultimate trump card in any kind of debate between Georgia fans and Alabama fans, the fact that Alabama has had more success thus far against Georgia than Georgia has had against Alabama in this Kirby Smart era. But even that, I think, can be reframed. I believe it probably should. Alabama fans think that record alone is enough to stop all discussions. But we don't feel that way here. We look at a couple of games in the early days of Kirby Smart as Georgia coach, 2017 National Championship, 2018 SEC Championship. I mean, to face facts here, Alabama was a very big favorite in both those games. Kirby Smart was just starting his coaching career there at that particular time. The fact that he even had Georgia in a national championship to play Alabama in 2017 was, we believe, a remarkable accomplishment. And in 2018, to be right back there again, that was proof of the staying power of Georgia. Alabama's like a 9-point favorite that day. Of course, they're supposed to win, and they did, although not covering the spread. Evidence, once again, that Georgia was being built up by Kirby Smart very quickly in a way that would become a problem for Alabama. How do we know that was true? because after that national championship in 2017, in just Smart's second year at Georgia for Alabama, they didn't win another one post Kirby Smart until like a pandemic year of 2020. And in the last 3 years for Nick Saban as a head football coach, he didn't win any national championships at all. Kirby Smart won 2. So in retrospect, the narrative that somehow Georgia had to wait for a long time to finally topple Alabama is precisely opposite. The real truth is it is remarkable how quickly Kirby Smart built up Georgia to eventually become Alabama's equal and then surpass it as a program, including beating it on the field in 2021. That's the remarkable story here. So this idea that somehow it would mean so much to Georgia to beat Alabama because of the problems that Alabama's created for Georgia, the actual truth is the rise of Georgia became a huge problem for the all-time great coach in Nick Saban, kind of taking away from him that opportunity to have one last great final moment as a coach. He wasn't able to get it because Kirby Smart and Georgia stood in his way to prevent that from happening. And those, I'm thinking, are just the facts here. And furthermore, this is a little bit of a clunky analogy, but follow me in this just for a moment. If you like old-time baseball or something like that, I'm talking about the kind of baseball that happened before you were born. You know, one of the things you may know is think about like all-time great players, like, say, Joe DiMaggio, Mickey Mantle, guys like that. Obviously, Mantle and DiMaggio were kind of two different eras of the sport, right? Even though at the very end of the DiMaggio career, that kind of overlapped with the start of the Mickey Mantle career. But we don't think about those guys as contemporaries. We think about them as completely different eras. There was a small overlap between the two, but that's sort of a trivial footnote to the careers that mostly took place in completely different generations from a baseball standpoint. Well, ultimately, many decades from now, that's the way that Kirby Smart and Nick Saban are going to be thought of too. Yes, there was a brief overlap between their two coaching careers, but if Kirby goes on to coach as long as he possibly could, he'll just simply be thought of as a coach from a different era than Nick Saban when you start looking at this from the perspective of history, in the distant future, looking back on the past. That's just how that's going to be viewed. So the idea that Saban finished with more wins head-to-head against Kirby Smart than Kirby Smart had against him, ultimately that's not going to matter very much at all in the way that both of these coaches will be eventually considered. And if you're a Georgia fan, you might need that reframe. And so take that as a gift if you'd like to. This idea that Alabama fans think they have something over you because their guy beat your guy more frequently. You know, the 2021 SEC championship was essentially an exhibition. The game that mattered was the national championship. That's the one that Georgia won. And in some of these instances, 2022 college football playoff, 2019 SEC championship, 2022 SEC championship. These were moments when maybe Georgia could have also beaten Alabama, but Alabama was nowhere to be found. They simply didn't qualify for the game. So maybe take that as a gift here if you need that reframe from the Alabama fans who are constantly pushing that in your face, the record for Nick Saban against Kirby Smart. So if that's not what the game means, then what does it mean? What does it mean for Georgia? Perhaps what does it mean for Alabama? To me, this sort of comes down to this. Is Georgia really ready to rule and really ready to reign in this post-Nick Saban era? Is Georgia ready to kind of assume its status as the unquestioned bull of the woods here in the SEC and in college football overall? Because for all the talk of this being the same old Alabama and the same standard at Alabama and, the same challenge of, beating Alabama that would be in the Nick Saban era, we're going to find out more about that on Saturday, but it becomes hard to push the notion that this is the same Alabama when you see just how different, I'm talking about visually, obviously different Alabama is right now. And listen, it's not my place here to tell you that this makes Alabama worse. It's really not. It's just an open acknowledgement that things are different, that Saban's retirement, because he was such a pivotal figure and he was such a great coach. And listen, you call us Georgia homers if you want to. We probably are. But I don't know any hardcore Georgia fan that doesn't give Nick Saban the credit he deserves for being a great coach. I've never seen a Georgia fan that was unwilling to acknowledge Saban's greatness. And so therefore, Saban's retirement does create a new era for the sport. And who gets to be in charge in this new era? Who gets to be on top in this new era? That is what this is all about. And if you don't believe me that this new era for college football ushers in one that's very different for Alabama overall, take it from someone who knows that program better than I do. Did you hear Friday's show when our buddy Mike Johnson, the former Alabama All-American who goes back to Tuscaloosa and watches games and gets access to the program as a former letterman? And he's not saying this in a critical way, of course, but just in sort of an observational way, that in terms of how Kalen DeBoer is choosing to go about his business at Alabama right now, it is far different the way that Nick Saban operated prior to that at Alabama. And I think that's an important context as we discuss what this game means on Saturday. So let me let you hear Mike Johnson on the subject of this just being, frankly, a very different version of Alabama overall.
Well, it's been awkward, to be quite honest with you. I got a chance to go over a couple of weeks ago on the Saban Field dedication day and got a chance to speak to Coach Saban and be around some of my old teammates, and we continued to comment. It's just different. I'm trying, BA, with all my heart to get used to a new brand of football because it's a new era, right? It's the portal era. It's the NIL era. But some of the celebrations you've seen, some of the Bama players taking selfies on the sideline, they got two true freshmen over there that have started a podcast. Lord knows that Nick Saban's probably he would lose his mind if that ever happened. You got coordinators talking to the media. It's different. I think Bama fans, for the most part, are trying to adjust to it and not at every wrong turn say, well, Nick Saban wouldn't have let that happen. I think that's the challenge moving forward. But, there was a big topic, BA. Kalen DeBoer comes out in like a light hoodie for the first game. And everybody's like, oh, my God, he's wearing a hood. The head coach on game day is wearing a hood. It's just different. That's what I keep reminding myself. It's not the same old Alabama. It's different. It's not a bad thing. It's not wrong. That's what I'm telling myself anyway.
There's an old saying that says that hard men make good times and good times make soft men. It's not my purpose to say that Kalen DeBoer is a soft man, but he is by appearance a little softer than Nick Saban. But DeBoer also inherited the good times that Saban created for Alabama. Can a very different style of Alabama coach work on Saturday against Georgia? Can it keep the good times that Saban was responsible for going? I think that's a very provocative question for Saturday. So if we're having the discussion about what the game means, I think point blank it probably means more for Alabama than it does for Georgia. It means more for DeBoer than it does for Kirby because DeBoer has got to prove to the Alabama people that his style can be as successful as the very intense, very proven track record style that Nick Saban brought to Tuscaloosa. From that standpoint, I believe in this particular game, there is more pressure on Kalen DeBoer than there is on Georgia. But that doesn't mean that the game doesn't have a lot of meaning for Kirby Smart individually because it would seem now with Nick Saban no longer on the landscape that the board has been cleared. And the path towards true total dominance of college football can be in Kirby Smart's sight and can be within his grasp if they take advantage of it. But that obviously requires going on the road and winning a game like this. So what does it mean? Well, it means a lot for both sides. Pressure for DeBoer to prove that he can be a very different kind of coach with similar results than what Nick Saban typically got. And for Kirby Smart, the chance to demonstrate that this really is his era on top of the college football world. It's obvious why there's so much interest in this game. The storylines are rich. The narratives are plentiful. Dog fans after Saturday night are hoping they're on top when it's all said and done. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. We are happy to have you with us no matter how you get to us today. Live on video, 10 a.m. That's every platform, radio, Athens Sports Radio, 960 The Ref, podcast, wherever you find them, Apple, Spotify, everything else in between. Just really happy to have you here today, and so grateful to our friends at ServPro who make it all possible for you there as well. You know, obviously Georgia's hoping to go into Tuscaloosa on Saturday and create a mess for Alabama, playing rough, playing hard, and walking away a victor, and obviously leaving Bryant-Denny Stadium in shambles in the process. Well, guess what? If you find your own property in shambles here right now, our friends at ServPro want to step in for you there on that. They are restoration specialists. It means if you've had a fire breakout or some sort of like water pipe break or something like that, the huge damage that something like that can typically cause where, I mean, you've got just a recognizable mess. Well, our friends at ServPro want to get that cleaned up for you and put it all back together like it never even happened. That's what the restoration specialists of ServPro are all about. Every franchise also independently owned and operated there as well. That means when you do business with ServPro, you're doing business with someone who's got a vested interest in the outcome. They want satisfactory outcome just as badly as you do because that's the source of their livelihood, right? So that's what they're all about there. So please find them online. It's servpro.com, S-E-R-V. servpro.com for more on that today. The great folks at ServPro, they're restoration specialists doing great work for you in the event that you need to clean up fire damage, water intrusion, anything like that. ServPro's there for you there on that. And they also bring DawgNation Daily to us here today. And for that, we are extraordinarily grateful. All right, we're also grateful for Connor Riley. We're going to get him here coming up in just a moment. I'll give you another update on our DawgNation invasion here in a couple of minutes there as well. But prior to all of that, I want to go around the doghouse. And as I briefly mentioned off the top a moment ago, so we started the week. We actually kind of concluded last week with this, and we certainly started this week with it too. The idea that, man, we want to stir the pot if we can. We want to be the instigators if we possibly can. I am not above doing that if it creates the right vibe for the game on Saturday. This idea that, man, Georgia's edgy and Georgia's in a bad mood, and they're going to Tuscaloosa with the idea of taking it out on this Crimson Tide team and ruining the SEC debut for Kalen DeBoer. We have some evidence maybe today that some of this might be working just a little bit. Couldn't help but notice that yesterday when the Georgia wide receiver Arian Smith met with reporters, one of the things that Arian did mention, unsolicited by the way, is some of the stuff that they are hearing from outside voices here right now. So if you are hoping that the Georgia coaches, the Georgia players, the Georgia program itself kind of catches some of the intensity, the very strong vibes that seem to exist around Georgia fans here right now, perhaps some evidence that that contagion is spreading. Here is Arian Smith from yesterday on the idea of, kind of being in a little bit of a bad mood here right now and trying to use that to kind of create a certain level of focus. I think this is good stuff from Arian. Take a listen to this.
Yes, we definitely have like a chip on our shoulder because we're obviously another good team just like they are. So people can say what they say about the game and predictions. And so just trying not to let that bother us and play the game like we do any other game. And coach tells us we don't got to do anything else different to win the game that we do at practice. So just take what I do at practice and take it to Saturday.
Now, as promos go, that's probably not Dusty Rhodes' hard times, but at the same time, a little bit of acknowledgement, right? We have a chip on our shoulder. We feel like we're a good team, too. All of a sudden, there's all these predictions out there, seemingly noticing that a lot of folks right now are kind of predicting Alabama to win this game. Seems like some of that message is penetrating the wall that the Georgia program builds around itself here, and I take that as very good news. I mean, I think that Georgia's oftentimes at its best when it's doubted. Think about, I don't want to make too much of this, but think about how many great performances from Georgia have come when there was something of a civil war going on among Georgia fans. Orange Bowl game against Michigan, everybody was upset about the SEC championship. Tennessee game in 2022, some of that, based on the fact that Georgia kind of sleptwalked for some previous weeks. Some of the stuff around Stetson Bennett, all kinds of, things being said around him. When Georgia fans are kind of, throwing elbows with each other, oftentimes the Georgia team just goes out there and just lays waste to whoever they're about to play. And there's been a little bit of that over the course of the last couple of weeks. I don't want to belabor that point too much, but there's a little infighting among the fan base here right now on a couple of topics perhaps. Well, sometimes that's when an edgy Georgia team sort of shows up. And, sometimes maybe it's their outside critics they're shutting up, and sometimes it's, to be honest with you, some of y'all that they are shutting up. But whatever it takes to be ready, that's exactly what it seems like Georgia wants to do. And from Arian Smith's perspective, it sounds like they're kind of ready to do that. Now, fair and balanced here. I guess Alabama's apparently also trying to do the same thing. Alabama is a point spread underdog in this game. That's the line for the most part is pretty close to where it's been for the entirety going back to like the spring and summer when the first look-ahead line started showing up for these so-called games of the year. Line has not moved a ton from where it would have been way back then, but still, Alabama folks, low information types, are only now just becoming aware of that. And so, therefore, it's kind of a little bit of a storyline in Tuscaloosa, the fact that somehow, some way, the odds makers here have dared make Georgia a point spread favorite in this game, much the same way that yesterday we were trying to use everything we could to get Georgia fired up. To be fair, Alabama coach Kalen DeBoer is apparently also using some of that, try to get his team fired up. This is what he said about that yesterday.
I mean, that's no one's fault that that's the case, but obviously there's going to be, even if there's one doubter, right, it falls along with the Lank mentality. And that's what we get to do is let any of the naysayers, know what we're capable of. And that's no one's fault. That's what it is. That's a tribute to what people see in Georgia and how high level of a football team that they have, and to their credit, that's exactly what they are. And then for us, it's just a matter of doing what we can do and making sure that we present the best version of what we can be on Saturday, again through great preparation, great focus, making sure that we're feeling great about what we have, because we do. We feel like we have a football team that is a top tier team that just every day is going to continue to get better. And that's not just this week, that's not just next week, that's all season long.
He is different, man. He's different. He's different for Alabama. He's different for the SEC. He's at that podium and in this job because he's been successful. I'm not a grifter. I'm not going to lie to you. I mean, DeBoer won a lot of games to get the job that he got, including making the college football playoff and then winning in the college football playoff last year. So this is a successful football coach. But he's different for the SEC. And what it kind of comes down to is, can the man who speaks that way, that speaks that way in that manner, using those, mannerisms, can he sell that message to his team as well as Georgia can sell the Arian Smith message to its team? In other words, Arian Smith says, man, we got all these people predicting Alabama to win this game. We want to go out there and prove them they're wrong. Well, Kalen DeBoer says essentially the same thing in so many words. And so in a game in which you've got smart coaches and you've got talented players, like 1% edge one way or another can make a pretty big difference in the game. And so who gets that little small extra edge here, the emotional, intangible advantage? It's whoever sells it best during the week. So what we're about to learn is, can the personality style that we just saw on display for Kalen DeBoer, can he really sell that? Can he really sell that? Can Georgia still sell it now as well as it sold it in the past? Because there's no guarantee just because you've done it before, you can kind of go back to that well and kind of call back on that same level of energy once again. This is a close football game. I think it's going to be hard fought. And I think the outcome, for the most part, for me, is still pretty much in doubt. We're kind of working our way through all of this here right now. But those little tiny extra edges, who has the personality, who has the style, who has the ability to project that feeling onto the rest of his team, that's a big question to answer there on Saturday night. And that is Around the Doghouse here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. Now, before I bring on Connor Riley, let me also give you a reminder that Saturday is also the big day for the DawgNation Invasion tailgate. Now, this is going to be an amazing time. If you're watching on video, you see an example there of our DawgNation Invasion t-shirt. First, 150 to sign up. Get one of those DawgNation Invasion t-shirts. I believe we have a limited supply of those left. So jump in there and get involved there on that. Big tailgate on Saturday. If you want to be a part of the Friday night party, you get a chance to do that. If you need some travel packages, which include rooms there in the Hoover, Alabama area, short drive from Tuscaloosa, our friends at Atlanta Sports Trips got you covered on that. You can talk to them about that kind of travel package. If you don't want the room, but you do want the bus over to Tuscaloosa, they got you on that. That's a really good deal. So all kinds of options for you to make a DawgNation Invasion a part of your Georgia-Alabama weekend. All of this brought to you by our friends at Atlanta Sports Trips, Discover Dunwoody, Dr. Pepper, Meriwether and Tharp, Kroger, and R.S. Andrews. So please go to DawgNation.com/tailgate. Last minute push to get involved here. Make sure you do that today. DawgNation.com/tailgate for more on that. All right, before we're done today, Hugh Freeze has said something crazy again. And I think it's sort of starting to get a little bit weird and perhaps worse by the day for him. We'll talk about what we think this means here coming up in a little bit for a hated Georgia rival. Also, some interesting recruiting news before we're done on the program today there as well. But for now, what's it going to take to beat Alabama on Saturday? Mindset in both Tuscaloosa and Georgia. And, oh, yeah, by the way, the injury situation for UGA there, too. Let's cover all of that with Connor Riley here right now on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
We shall say hello to Connor Riley here. Great coverage from Athens yesterday. And Connor, I'll start with some of that here right now. As it comes to, in the topic of Kirby Smart updating on Georgia injuries, obviously maybe this was not unexpected, but did not quite get that hopeful message on Mykel Williams. Kirby giving the dreaded, we're hopeful to get him back, which is basically a eulogy for the most part when it comes to a player's chances of playing. What do you make of praise for Jordan Hall and his attempt to come back, but not a whole lot of guarantee that Georgia's going to necessarily be all that much healthier with the defensive front than it was for the game against Kentucky now 2 weeks ago?
Well, Warren Brinson I think is going to play in this game based off what we've heard from Kirby Smart. He practiced this week. Xavier McLeod played in that Kentucky game. It was his first game. He's gotten healthier since then as well. I do think that Mykel Williams is going to play in this game. That's not based off anything that is said. That is not based off of what Kirby Smart has indicated. That is just sort of a hunch. I don't know how effective Mykel is going to be, but I believe Mykel is this type of competitor that wants to be out there, that wants to play in this game and show that he can give and help this team. And so we'll see what that ultimately ends up looking like. But I do think that Georgia's defensive line will end up being in a better spot come Saturday. But at the same point in time, this Alabama offensive line is the best group that Georgia has faced yet. And we're going to learn a lot about this Georgia defensive line thus far, which, injuries aside, I thought has played very, very well so far to start this season. But this is a consequential matchup. I think whichever unit between Alabama's defensive front or Georgia's defensive front and Alabama's offensive line has the better day is probably going to end up winning this game.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it kind of goes back to the old difference between the availability of a player and the health status of a player. You know, you may play, but the adage I always kind of fall back to is if we think a player's hurt, whether it be a player for Georgia or a player from Alabama or anywhere else, if we think you're hurt, that means you probably are, which means if you're not fully healthy, I'm not really quite so sure, even in the case of someone like Mykel Williams, who's obviously very talented, if you're trying to go out there and play and yet you're really essentially still injured, then it's a little bit like Brock Bowers or Ladd McConkey in like an SEC championship last year. You may be standing out there, but you're really not doing much, for Georgia. Unfortunately, I guess I sort of assume that if we see 13 on the field, my assumption is he's probably not doing much for Georgia other than just being a presence on the field, because if there are this many questions about his health status, then my assumption is he's probably still injured.
Well, I would push back there a little bit because if only, and this is maybe because you brought up Bowers and McConkey specifically, I think that Williams can do things a little differently that have an impact, whereas Bowers and McConkey, those guys need the ball in their hands to really make an impact last year. And you saw when that was the case, they weren't really able to do that. I think Mykel Williams, because of the base skill set that he has, is going to be able to occupy blockers and command attention in the run game. Does he make a difference in the pass rush in this game? I don't know that yet. I'll be interested in seeing what type of game Damon Wilson has, and specifically as well Jalen Walker, because he's a guy that I think Georgia needs to have a big game. He did against Alabama last year, but he only did so in 12 snaps. I have a feeling that Jalen Walker is going to play a lot more in this game, and Georgia's going to need him to do so, because when Georgia's needed stops this season, Jalen Walker has been able to get them. And so if Georgia's going to win on Saturday, they're going to ask Jalen Walker to do that again with Mykel Williams at the very least compromised.
Yeah, I mean, I know that Walker's a guy you've touted before, and you've been correct to do so. My belief is he may be Georgia's most important player, certainly on the defensive side of the ball. Jalen Walker's probably Georgia's most important player on Saturday. We've talked about him plenty over the last few days. He did have a strong statistical performance against Alabama a year ago. He may be the best source of pass rush for this Saturday, too. That's a very important player for Georgia, perhaps the most important player on that side of the ball this weekend.
Yeah, and it's a Jalen versus Jalen matchup. Jalen Milroe, for all he might not be as a complete quarterback, This guy is a one-man explosive play at any time in the game. And we've seen before that if you're going to beat Georgia, explosive plays are a great way to do it. And so Jalen Walker is going to be tasked, I think, with negating or trying to limit what Milroe can do in this game. And I think we all look back at that Alabama game a year ago. You wonder if maybe Georgia might be okay taking some more chances on the back end in order to get more pressure on Milroe in this game, because I think they were way too conservative last year in terms of the way that they went about attacking Milroe. They very much wanted to keep him in the pocket and force him to win with his arm, and he was able to do that for the most part. I know he got some help from the officiating there with the Isaiah Bond catch, and Alabama's wide receivers this year, while Ryan Williams has been great so far this year, I don't think that he is at the same altitude in terms of, on the mountain that, say, an Isaiah Bond or even a Jermaine Burton were a season ago. So I think that this game, Georgia might be willing to take some more risks on the back end in order to get more pressure on Milroe up front.
You had an interesting story at DawgNation.com looking at the way in which Georgia players experienced last year's loss and kind of how that might still motivate them here right now. I know yesterday Smile Mondon talked a little bit about that. What is your perspective on how last year's game might act as a source of motivation for this year's team?
They have not been very demure about it. They have been very upfront, very loud, I think, about the impact that game had. And, I saw that you last week played the Jalen Milroe clip that from the radio interview after that game. Georgia players are well aware of that. I don't think you necessarily needed to bring that up. But I think that for Georgia in this game, look, for a lot of guys on this team, that's the only loss in their college career. Malachi Starks is a 2-year now going into his 3rd year as a starter. That's the one game in his college career that he has lost. And so I think that fact weighs on a lot of guys. Carson Beck came back to Georgia because he lost that game and, quite frankly, did not play all that well that day. So I think that this is a game where they know that they need to go out there and prove it. They're well aware of the fact that what bozos like me are saying that, Georgia had a Nick Saban problem. Now they might have an Alabama problem if they lose this game. And that can't be the case. So I think that this team is going to come out motivated. There's been a lot of chatter already this week. I can go ahead and tell you a bunch of people on College Game Day are probably all going to pick Alabama. It's going to be an Alabama love fest in the national media this week. And while, yes, Georgia is technically favored right now, it's not going to feel that way when you engage in the discourse. And so I would expect Georgia to be well aware of that, pointing to both last year's game, but also, as Kirby Smart pointed out yesterday, this team didn't play all that well against Kentucky, and they know they've got to play a lot better on Saturday.
Yeah, it's my favorite version of Georgia in this era, the one where it does legitimately feel doubted. And, sometimes I kind of have joked about this earlier, that when there's a little bit of a civil war among the fan bases, when Georgia fans are kind of at each other's throats, that also, for whatever reason, seems to produce a pretty good version of Georgia. So if there is a little orneriness here right now, if there is some kind of, sort of bad mood kind of syndrome kind of going through the fan base and the team itself, that usually produces a pretty good version of Georgia. So I'm kind of here for that a little bit. I like the idea of some edginess going into a game like this, because I don't know why, and perhaps it's just coincidence, but oftentimes that usually produces a pretty fun version of UGA.
Right. I mean, you can look at the Michigan game. You can look at that Alabama national championship game. You can look at the Tennessee game in 2022 when, to extend your analogy, the UGA fan base is a house divided. Kirby Smart has proven to be a pretty effective link in his ability to give the theoretical Georgia democracy in terms of turning this program around and bringing everyone together, both fan base and players. So I think they've got another opportunity to do this on Saturday. And I know that Kirby Smart knows going into this game. I mean, honestly, this might be the biggest regular season game in Smart's time here, at least in terms of going in terms of what this might mean coming out of it. I think maybe you could point to the 2018 Florida game as maybe the counterpoint to that, with all that was going on with the Jake Fromm and the Justin Fields aspect of it all, coming off that loss to LSU. But I think that this has a chance to be as much as a regular season game can be, a defining game for Kirby Smart in his time at Georgia. And he's very mindful, I think, of that fact. And you heard that yesterday in the press conference.
So let me ask you this on the other side of that, because I played the clip of Kalen DeBoer a little earlier. And look, DeBoer is where he is because of his success. I am not here to tell you that Kalen DeBoer is not a good coach or anything like that. man, he is so different. Different for Alabama. I would say different for the SEC. He just sort of brings a Pacific Northwest vibe down to our league here. And we played the clip of him talking about the fact that Alabama's the point spread underdog at home and the fact that they're as bothered by that, supposedly, as all of the Georgia people are by all of the predictions for Alabama that we're about to hear. And I think it's just sort of fair to say some of this kind of comes down to who can sell their message the best. Can Georgia sell the "we're mad" message to itself, as well as Kalen DeBoer can sell, whatever it is that he's going to try to sell? I mean, that's what a lot of this is, right? It's like, we know that Georgia's been in these sort of street fight type games before, and they have found the right mindset for it. Maybe not against Alabama as much as some fans would have liked, but they at least beat Alabama in the 2021 national championship game. I think we're going to learn a lot about how well Kalen DeBoer, a different kind of personality, how well he can sell nastiness to his team that probably needs it. Either side needs it if they want to win this particular Saturday.
Yeah, I think you're going to see both coaches getting very cutesy in their press conferences this week in terms of selling narratives that they're the underdog. Both want to go out there and claim that. And when in reality, look, both of these teams in terms of talent are still absolute juggernauts. And if you want to, lean into the fact that they're an underdog, look, when Kalen DeBoer was at Washington, he had a less talented team than Dan Lanning did all 3 times that they matched up on the field together. And Kalen DeBoer won all 3 of those games. And so, look, Kalen DeBoer is not an underdog. This Alabama program, quite frankly, is not an underdog in my mind. Nick Saban still recruited a ton of those players there, specifically on the lines of scrimmage, where I think this Alabama team is at its strongest. So both of these sides feel that they're the underdog. In reality, both these guys, I think, know deep down they're favorites, and they need to go out there and dominate on Saturday. And whichever team I think is able to impose their will over what I expect will be a 4-quarter game, as it usually is when these two teams play, is going to come out the winner. And frankly, in my mind, will be the best team in college football. I know everyone wants to give Arch Manning and Texas everything right now, but whoever wins this game, this will be, in my mind, the definitive best win in college football to this point. And that will make them the number 1 team in the country.
You mentioned Jalen Milroe a minute ago. Over the course of the calendar year, we start talking about this stuff in like late December, early January, and then we ride it for the entire year until we get to the fall and the season begins. I have probably upgraded my opinion of Alabama over the course of the year ahead of the start of the season, maybe more than I anticipated that I would. And some of that reconsideration for me was kind of around Jalen Milroe. The fact of the matter is, this is a guy who was in the college football playoff last year. His coach DeBoer for a different team was also getting that experience too. But I think I've kind of come to believe that Jalen Milroe is probably a better quarterback now than I once did. And Kirby talked yesterday about him being a little bit more comfortable kind of as a traditional pocket passer and a thrower. I think you've got to respect that. I bet tomorrow, I know that Ryan Williams kind of gives them the dimension of the receiver position that we're used to the very best Alabama team sort of having. But talk to me a little bit more about the specific challenge of stopping Jalen Milroe, because while I don't think that Georgia had a particularly, effective game plan against him last year, the truth is you can have a good game plan and Milroe can still have success, because I've just sort of grown to believe that he's probably a better quarterback than at one point in time I'd given him credit for. So, what do you think about the specific challenge for Georgia facing Milroe here this weekend?
You heard Kirby say it on Monday. He is as dynamic as a player as there has been in college football. And, sure, he might not be the most polished quarterback of all time, but this guy makes big plays better than just about anyone. And he's able to, and this is a credit to Kalen DeBoer and the offense that he has at Washington. There was a lot of talk this offseason about how Milroe was going to fit in the DeBoer offense because of maybe the stylistic differences between Milroe and current Atlanta Falcons backup, who can't for some reason come in and run a 4th down sneak on 4th and inches, Michael Penix. But what Milroe does, I think, match up a little bit to what that Washington offense did well. His best attribute is throwing outside the numbers, using that incredible arm strength that he has. That's what Washington did a lot last season. There was a lot of success in that. And so far, they've been able to marry their games together. Now, as far as what we've seen on the field from Alabama, you could take the best players from Western Kentucky, South Florida, and Wisconsin and form an all-star team, and it would still not be as good as the defense that Georgia has on Saturday. And so we're going to see just how much this jump in competition that Alabama will face on Saturday is going to impact the way that we see Milroe and the way that Milroe goes about playing, because I think this Georgia defense is much, much faster than anything he has seen to this point. And from a skill player standpoint, I actually think that this defense might be able to do some things to these Alabama skill players that those previous defenses have just proven incapable of doing. So I think that there's going to be a lot on the shoulders of Jalen Milroe in this game. Georgia put the whole game plan on Jalen Milroe a year ago, and Milroe was able to make enough plays to win at the end. We're going to see if he's going to be able to do so again on Saturday.
Yeah, I still think that Georgia was too deferential to him. I still think that Georgia almost gave him too much respect last December. I think he's a better quarterback now than he was then. So obviously you got to be very aware of what he can do. But at the same time, you've also got to do things that kind of disrupt what he wants to do, there as well. Just seeing Georgia be more impactful, trying to create some negative plays, boy, that kind of looms for me as a very big storyline in this game.
Well, and the biggest difference in this game between this year and last year is this inside linebacker room. Yeah. Georgia was not healthy and not, quite frankly, experienced in that inside linebacker room. And you saw that in that game. Raylan Wilson gives up a big touchdown on a wheel route early in that game. I think that you look at what Alabama did in that game. Small Munden was hurt. Small Munden was effectively playing on a broken foot and had surgery after that game and was just not himself. He's healthier now. He's not maybe 100%, but he's getting there. I think C.J. Allen and Raylan Wilson have continued to take steps in their development and have just seen more. They've played more football. They've started more games, and I think are ready to have a bigger impact. I think Georgia has a better understanding of what they can do with Jalen Walker now than they did a season ago. And so that position group in particular, that inside linebacker room, and I know Jalen Walker is going to play some snaps at outside linebacker as well, but for the sake of this discussion, I think that this inside linebacker room, if this is the best position group that Georgia has, which I believe it to be, they're going to need to find a way to go out there and outplay Jalen Milroe and make life difficult. I believe they have the talent to do so. You've seen them do that at times during this season against Clemson, against Kentucky. I think that they're going to have to answer that bell one more time on Saturday and create those negative plays and create those turnovers like Raylan Wilson did against Kentucky, which proved to be the difference in that game. Can Jalen Walker get the sacks that we've all seen him do in the past? Can Small Munden get stops at the line of scrimmage there? The Georgia inside linebacker room shows up and plays like they are recruited and coached to do. I think that leads to a Georgia win on Saturday.
Connor, to finish up here, I have a least favorite number. My least favorite number is the number 24. Do you know why my least favorite number is the number 24?
Because at least in each of the last 3 losses that Georgia has to Alabama, they have finished stuck on 24. And in that first 2018 national championship game lost to Alabama, they finished with 23 points there as well. 24 has been a little bit of a cursed number, I would say, when it comes to Georgia. Alabama.
Yeah, 24 is a cursed number indeed. That's the point total that has led to these losses here. So I think you got to score 30 to win. I mean, you look at what has beaten Alabama on the road. They haven't lost very many home games in like the last decade, but what has beaten them? It's LSU in 2019, very big point total. It's Ole Miss in 2015, very big point total. These games that have resulted in Alabama losses have been big point totals. That's what's been required to beat them in their own building. I think Georgia's got to have at least 30 there on Saturday, which is obviously more than the 24 that's doomed them the last 3 times out here. So better performance for the Georgia offense. Are you anticipating that?
I feel like we're back in 2018. For all that has changed over the years with DawgNation, all the different studios, all the national championships that Georgia has now won, the highs, the lows through it all, we're still talking about Georgia has to get to that 30-point threshold. And they haven't proven to be able to consistently do that. The one time they got over 30 was in that national championship game when they had a late defensive touchdown that added to that point total. And quite frankly, Georgia might need something like that again to get to that 30-point threshold. And I think this defense is capable of doing that. But this offense has a ton of questions to answer. And I think that they're going to have the potential to answer them on Saturday. I believe that Georgia has intentionally not played with its full hand just yet. I think that they can use Dylan Bell a lot more. I think that there are things that they can do with guys like a Trevor Etienne, like a Colby Young, like even, say, London Humphreys, that they have not felt the need to do so. I think not until late in that Kentucky game did you really see Georgia start to play with the sense of urgency that they needed to really move the ball consistently. I expect them to come out and do that on Saturday right from the jump. And look, like last year, Georgia scripted a perfect opening drive against Alabama and was up 7-0 early in that game. Wouldn't shock me in the slightest if Georgia does that again. They've got to find ways to make adjustments and deal with things over the course of this game. Now, I think this is an area where it helps you greatly to not be facing Nick Saban on the other sideline, because for as great as Kalen DeBoer is, and I believe he is a great coach, he and his staff don't have the same level of familiarity with this Georgia staff. I wrote about it this morning on a story that's on DawgNation.com right now. Like Nick Saban in Alabama, they went after the same assistants. They went after the same recruits. Kalen DeBoer was not doing that in his time at Washington. And so I think that this game, because Georgia has such an intimate knowledge of this Alabama roster still, I think that does maybe in some ways give them a leg up in terms of being able to make in-game adjustments and having just a greater sense of knowledge in terms of what Alabama in some ways is working with, even with all the newness that comes with that Alabama staff.
Connor, it's fascinating. I appreciate your time. I look forward to a remarkable just build up to the game there on Saturday. It's going to be just an amazing, just like carnival of craziness in Tuscaloosa. So I am here for it all. We appreciate your coverage, and I look forward to talking to you soon here on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro.
As always, it was a pleasure.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So what Connor just mentioned there was a little bit similar to what somebody had brought up to me, had reached out to me on the X platform. For all the talk about Georgia getting off to a faster start, what somebody had said was, hey, BA, in the last two games Georgia's lost, they actually did get off to an okay start, but it wasn't enough to prevent the loss, which is an interesting kind of context and backdrop for Saturday's game. So what about this as a meager goal? And I try to be as realistic as I possibly can. But at least one touchdown in every quarter. Because obviously, not to go back to bad history, and it's not a Nick Saban Alabama team on Saturday, but it's still, a tough opponent, right? Big game, tough opponent. In 2017 National Championship, 2018 SEC Championship, these were big first halves that could not be matched in the second half. We've seen that version of Georgia in some of those big games if you want to go back many years ago. So you need a faster start for sure. You also need to play for 4 quarters. So how about that? At least a touchdown in every quarter. That's 28 points. I'm capable of doing that math. I know you're impressed. That's 28 points right there. And then finding some other score some other way, whether it be a field goal, whether it be a defensive score, whether it be, a turnover that makes a short field that makes, an additional touchdown that much easier, whatever else. But how about it's just sort of a meager goal, at least one touchdown in every quarter? Doesn't that seem like a pretty good recipe for victory there on Saturday? At least worth considering. Let's get ready now to go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And I tell you, I am so excited about all the great things that Royal Caribbean's got in store here for 2025. And I'm excited myself about my chance to be back on another Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. I'll tell you this. We always talk about my buddy Jessica Slater, the terrific travel agent. Well, because Jessica and I've used her to book plenty of travel before. One of the things that Jessica does is if something comes from Royal Caribbean, she'll send that in the mail to me and her other past clients. And so my daughter likes to get the mail, and so she goes out and gets the mail of the day, and she sees this thing. She's like, Royal Caribbean, we got to plan a cruise. And so she's had this brochure running around the house, trying to figure out when we're going to be taking a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation here very soon on Utopia of the Seas, because that's what the brochure was for. And so I told her, I said, hey, listen, we'll get it done here, try to get it planned, and so we see if we can figure out a time to be back again with our friends at Royal Caribbean on board Utopia of the Seas. And of course, Jessica can help you there as well. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. And by the way, you may also be hearing more about that with our Golden Shoe a little bit later on. But for now, though, let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Interesting update here when it comes to recruiting. Jeff Sintel has the story for you at DawgNation.com. We now have a commitment date for the 4-star running back Ousmane Kromah from Lee County. Very good running back, a guy who I think a lot of Georgia fans have liked for a long time because of the fact that Kromah has been productive for literally the entirety of his high school career. Was a very good player as a freshman. Probably did not quite get as early an offer from Georgia as some people thought that he might, just given how productive he was really from the word go when it came to his high school career. But it seems like Georgia now with Josh Crawford as running backs coach, who has pretty deep ties to Lee County, it seems like Georgia's a pretty big factor in Kromah's recruitment now. So in a battle that probably comes down to Auburn and Florida State, Florida State has the geographic advantage. Auburn has probably been in on Kromah longer. It does seem like now, though, that Georgia's being given a legitimate chance of winning this recruiting battle, which for most UGA fans, I think would be treated as very good news, but just because of how good that he's been. It's also kind of worth watching for a story we're about to get into as it relates to Auburn. My belief is, as bad as the 2024 season is for Auburn, they're probably still a pretty big factor when it comes to talent acquisition for 2025 and putting a better team in place. So we'll watch them in a recruiting battle like this of, can they hold their own when all of a sudden Georgia has decided to kind of reinvigorate its efforts going after a player like this? Kromah, one to watch. September 28th is Saturday, by the way. So what's already going to be a busy day gets even busier as we watch for Ousmane Kromah. Now, speaking of Auburn, yesterday, Hugh Freeze, the Auburn coach, fresh off what was sort of thought as kind of throwing his own players under the bus after the loss to Arkansas, does his radio show yesterday. And in the midst of all of this, says, I have a lot of respect for Sam Pittman, but when it comes to Arkansas, I believe if we played them 9 more times, we'd win every one of those games. Now, by and large, I probably like Freeze as a coach more than some of y'all do. I'm openly willing to acknowledge that. I think that Freeze has been given kind of a sort of a condemnation for some very bad things that he's done. Let's not pretend otherwise. I think that Freeze has gotten condemned for what he's done when a lot of other coaches are guilty of very, very similar things. But somehow that seems to be kind of part of the joking backstory with them. And yet in the case of Freeze, it's sort of viewed as an unpardonable sin. I won't explain my feelings on that any further. But that's some of my take on Hugh Freeze. But the point is that I have largely been of the belief, and I've thought this ever since the Cal game, that that Auburn appeared to be tanking. Now, that's a strange thing to say because there is no draft picks in college football. There isn't the obvious incentive to tank the way that sometimes you would perceive there would be in the NFL or other professional sports that are kind of draft-oriented. But I still sort of get the suspicion that Auburn is kind of it knows it's bad, and so therefore it's not doing a whole lot to pretend it's not bad because they want donors motivated to give more money for NIL. They want recruits and transfers to see the open opportunity for playing time that exists at Auburn. And my guess is that they are more than happy to sacrifice the 2024 season as a way of being ready to chase down as much talent as they can get starting in December when the portal opens and the early signing period takes place and things like that. They are just trying to set themselves up to be open for business at that particular time. And all they're asking is for their people to be patient for a little while they make the attempt for that to happen. That's my perception here. Maybe I'm wrong. I am frequently. However, let's assume for a moment that I'm not wrong. Let's assume for a moment that is what Auburn's trying to do. You can ruin all that with too many crazy statements. And this is a pretty crazy statement. This is just the kind of thing that is just, I think, excessively distasteful. Talking trash about a game that you lost, bragging about a hypothetical of what you would do in a situation that will never occur in real life, that's just bad. And Freeze, part of the reason why you hire him at Auburn is because he's supposed to know the landscape here in the SEC. He's supposed to know his way around things. And I'm sorry, part of what you're supposed to be able to navigate is the media. And last year, prior to the Auburn game, for Georgia, he said a bunch of crazy stuff. That he seems to sort of have a lot of unforced errors with the media. That's the kind of thing you just really cannot do if you're trying to build a program into a winner or have your fans be patient while you're not winning. So I would say that's a pretty big error from Hugh Freeze yesterday. Now, let's also give you some early thoughts here on a couple of the big games of the upcoming weekend. I think Ole Miss hosting Kentucky's pretty fascinating. Ole Miss has played like nobody at all thus far this year. They've had one road game at Wake Forest. Now, Kentucky's not very good. They're nowhere near as good as Georgia made them look, last Saturday. But nonetheless, this is a big step up in weight class for an Ole Miss team that obviously fancies itself as a playoff contender. That's a pretty fascinating game. Elsewhere in the SEC, you've got Arkansas fresh off their win against Auburn going to Texas A&M. We'll see if Sam Pittman's squad can kind of stay hot there. Speaking of Auburn, they also host Oklahoma. Now, this is one of those deals where if you're Oklahoma, you got to be careful here. My assumption is that Auburn's bad enough it might not matter, and that maybe after Saturday, everybody has a full picture of just exactly how bad Auburn might be. But if you're Oklahoma, you got to be careful, because in the SEC, there is a requirement that does not exist in the Big 12. Sometimes you got to shake it off, and you got to go back out there in harm's way once again and find a way to get yourself a win. If it doesn't happen for Oklahoma, which is not, by the way, starting Jackson Arnold on Saturday, they're going to start the other guy who came in for Arnold. It felt like a knee-jerk reaction to me from Brent Venables, but Oklahoma on the road at Auburn, be very careful there on that. Texas begins SEC play against Mississippi State, who just got beat pretty bad by Florida. I mean, could you play an easier schedule than Texas is playing right now? Everyone has noticed that. Speaking of easy schedules, Ohio State finally plays a Power 4 conference opponent. They'll take on Michigan State on Saturday. Once again, barely any step up in weight class there. I guess the only other thing we'll note right now is Illinois team that's playing better than most people thought traveled to Penn State there on Saturday. So that's maybe the biggest game outside the SEC there on Saturday. We'll make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Now, let me also give a shout out to our friends at Beaver Toyota. First of all, it's great to have Beaver Toyota as a part of what we're doing here on DawgNation Daily. And I love what they're doing right now when it comes to the shopping experience for your next automobile. They're making it so convenient. You can do that right there from the comfort of your home. It's fast, it's fun, it's convenient. You can, listen, if you're like me, I'm going to baseball practice, cheerleading practice, trying to, have dinner with my wife, things like that. We're just running around all over the place. So you're able to squeeze this into your busy lifestyle just the same way that we would be trying to do the same thing there for you there as well. And in addition to that, shop online and have the car delivered right to you. That's what our friends at Beaver Toyota are all about. So please find them online. Here's the website. It's beavertoyotacumming.com. beavertoyotacumming.com. I don't live over there anymore, but I used to drive by Beaver Toyota all the time. Beautiful lot, great looking, location, all kinds of beautiful automobiles, a wonderful Toyota product. So make sure you find them, beavertoyotacumming.com for more on that. And speaking of our great sponsors, both of our golden shoes today, shouts out to wonderful sponsors. Let me show you the first one on the screen here. How about Kev Dog, who's at DogTime50 on the X platform, writes in to say, I just got off my first Royal Caribbean cruise on Utopia of the Seas. It was an incredible experience. By the way, the picture here, if you're watching a video, first of all, you love the Georgia swimming trunks. You got Utopia of the Seas there in the background at Perfect Day Coco Cay. Kev says he highly recommends it. And, of course, we use the wonderful services of Jessica Slater as recommended by BA and the staff at DawgNation. Can't wait for the next one. Kev, truly, sincerely, you have no idea what that means to me because, A, I love the fact that I get something right. And I really do believe that these Royal Caribbean cruise vacations and going to Perfect Day Coco Cay is as fun as it gets. I'm glad to know you had as much fun. I love Jessica taking great care of you. And obviously, it just fills me with pride to know that you would support one of our great sponsors. So thank you for that. And speaking of that there as well, how about another golden shoe going out to our buddy Philip Thomas, who is already on his way for DawgNation Invasion in his RV. He says, we started the DawgNation Invasion early. We're all set up at the Oak Mountain State Park, south of Birmingham, on the brand new fifth wheeler. We'll see you Friday night and Saturday. Hashtag Go Dogs, hashtag Golden Shoe. Philip also saying we also took advantage of the tailgate and the bus ride at the hotel stay for our DawgNation Invasion. He says, my wife inquired before we knew it was possible. And Holly, who was our friend there from Atlanta Sports Trips, she set it up. I'm glad you are promoting that now for everybody else. So, Philip, that's great to hear. I'm glad you're going to be there. I love the fact that Invasion has already started those RVs descending on the state of Alabama. We're about to take it over, hopefully walking back home with a victory. You love all of that. Philip, a well-earned golden shoe going out to you and your lovely wife for that there as well. Lousy, stinking Gators, barely even relevant anymore. It's been 1,417 days since they have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs. That's good news, and that is our Gator Hater Updater. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all of that. All right, I'm going to go through the comments here. We'll find out what's on everybody's mind. I'm going to start on the Facebook side of things here for a moment. Al Chandler says we've had refs change the game almost every single time we've played Alabama. And listen, I mean, I feel like I have hopefully a well-earned reputation. The last thing we do around here is talk about officiating. We just don't do a lot of that kind of thing. But I did think with the bad call a year ago, the SEC probably deserved a better explanation. Or I should say the SEC owed Georgia and anyone who was watching the game a better explanation on the Isaiah Bond call. Did not really get that. But, I think that you can want it and not get it, but wanting more than you got last year after a bad call, you probably deserve that. Matt Rukavina says the so-called hex for Alabama over Georgia was broken the moment Bama recovered a fluke, quote-unquote fumble, only for Stetson Bennett to lead us back to victory in the title game. We need to out-physical them and win. I think Matt's absolutely right. As Smile Mondin, I thought Mondin was great yesterday. You can go watch the full video. I don't know if we played any Mondin on today's show, but you can go watch the full video. I thought he was really good. Asking about, getting over the mountain of Alabama. He says, why is this a mountain? We've already beaten them. And that's exactly right. In Mondin's career, that has happened. Megan Womack says, has anyone thought that maybe Saban's ego might not want DeBoer to win? I mean, I've certainly I've pondered that. A little bit like we said, for Kirby, that we predicted that the moment that Kirby won a national championship, Saban would try to make himself a part of the story as someone who helped train Kirby for that moment. I think that if we're being honest, Saban probably wants DeBoer to win to the extent that Saban can get the credit for helping pave the way for DeBoer to win. I don't think anyone likes the idea of their legacy being erased. I don't. I think that Nick Saban would be the same way. So I believe that Nick Saban is going to have a personal interest in making himself part of the story here this weekend. And obviously ESPN likes to do that because they just only know one way to do anything, which is heavy-handed and overdone. Jamie Huff says the game is going to come down to Beck stepping up. He's got to be a dog like Stetson Bennett. He can't be passive. The honest truth is I don't disagree. I really don't. I mean, there is an extent to which at a certain point the quarterback has an extra responsibility to go out and make plays. I mean, can you imagine how hard it must be to play quarterback? I mean, we watch football all the time. But do you ever really think about it? Like sometimes when I'm standing on a field, I find myself thinking about, what if I was the quarterback right now? What if I had to, even throwing to the sidelines longer than you think it is, physically it's challenging to even make the throws. Reading the defense is incredibly hard. You've got 100,000 people hoping that you fail, trying to get you off your game so that you will fail. Can you imagine how hard that must be? Do you ever think about that? Man, this would be really, really hard to do. And yet, that's why some guys are attracted to it, because they want to do the hardest possible things that can be done. And so if you're in that spot, there is just an extra responsibility to go out there and make plays. And I do believe that Beck has an extra responsibility to do that. It's you're going to get drafted no matter what. And you've got NIL checks no matter what. And you've got, whatever. You got all kinds of stuff. And to a certain extent, that stuff can't really be taken away from you. But there are a lot of rich people with no legacy. There just are. There are a lot of rich people in life who are forgotten the moment they are no longer with us. I don't mean to be morbid, but that's just the truth. It's one of the reasons why billionaires are always trying to buy sports teams or, philanthropic, endeavors and things like that, which frankly oftentimes do more harm than good, but that's a different topic for a different day. Really, really rich people, I'm talking about billionaires, late in life, they sort of realize that there are truly some things money can't buy. Respect is one of those things. Legacy is one of those things. And on a much smaller level, a future millionaire NFL quarterback can also discover the same thing too. It's like you can be Dak Prescott, for instance. Like Prescott is richer than most businesses. I mean, he produces more revenue than most businesses. And yet he's got zero legacy at all. At all. I mean, not a single professional accomplishment to his name, despite the fact that, he's getting paid a ton of money. And I just happen to think of him because I guess they lost to Baltimore on Sunday, but there's a bunch of quarterbacks for whom you could say the same thing for. And this is what Saturday's game is about. Not just for Beck, but quarterbacks all the time are playing games like this. It's the moment in which you earn for yourself the thing that money cannot buy. For instance, Stetson Bennett may never be truly rich. I mean, he's richer than me because NFL money's even at the sort of bottom end of the rosters is good money. But, I mean, there are people who listen to our show on a regular basis that have more money than Stetson Bennett has. I mean, there are people that own businesses and they're rich. They've got money. Bennett may never be as rich as some of you are, but he's got a legacy that money could not purchase. He won 2 national championships, and he did so in courageous fashion. That's the kind of thing that if you wanted to buy it, you wouldn't be able to. And so that's what's kind of fun about sports is that oftentimes, the money and the fame go hand in hand. Sometimes you can have one and not have the other. Sometimes you can have the other and not have the one. And we know that one way or another, Carson Beck's probably already a pretty rich guy and probably heading towards plenty of fame and money, as he kind of moves through his career. He's going to be drafted no matter what. But the kind of special legacy where you're revered, you're remembered, games like this are what earn that. And we'll see if Beck gets a chance to etch himself into the annals of history on Saturday. Let's see what else. Jay Harwell says that game day will be insufferable. Yeah, we've talked about this. It's going to be really bad. And there is precedent for this. ESPN did the same thing with Jason Kelsey on Monday Night Football a couple of weeks ago. It was awful. And it wasn't just Falcons fans who were feeling that way. They were pretty heavily criticized for all of that. And it may very well happen again. And I believe it probably will. Doghouse Lawn Care says that my daughter's first birthday this week, all she wants is to hand Kalen DeBoer his first loss. I love that. Should we make this trip for her first game in the DawgNation tailgate? Go Dogs. We'd love to have you there, Doghouse. We'd love to have you there. Celebrate your daughter's birthday with us. I think that sounds like a pretty good idea to me. That sounds like a pretty good idea indeed. Oh, that is awesome stuff. JT says our offensive game plan and being able to adjust on the fly is everything in a game like this. I agree with that. As Connor said, hey, really good scripted first drive for Georgia. Then they adjust. How do you adjust to that adjustment? Game within the game becomes very important. Brodo Baggins says if UGA wins, what will that mean for Alabama going forward? Well, the media say it's only because Saban wasn't the coach, discrediting this Bulldogs team. Well, honestly, I mean, Georgia's getting no credit for having beaten Clemson either. So, I like to use the media stuff to kind of create a good vibe for the game coming up. But if Georgia wins the game, the media can make whatever excuses they want to after that. I mean, at that point in time, I really am, taking the page from Kirby Smart and sort of on to the next after that. But yeah, I mean, I think there is an element to that, look, I have a lot of reasons I believe that there's a fascination with Alabama. Some of these I don't necessarily want to get into right now, but I think that let me just not do that. Let me take your comments instead. Let's see what else. Kenneth Holt says, I think our wide receivers can take advantage of their young and thin secondary. He says thin secondary depth, but that all relies on the offensive line giving back time, which didn't really happen against Kentucky. Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's probably not been the offensive line performance that I've been hoping for, at least thus far. Time for that to change. I mean, there is time for that to change, but it's probably not been great. And I also think if the offense is kind of like firing on all cylinders, then all of a sudden, I think the job of the offensive line probably gets a little bit easier. If Georgia really is as effective both running it and throwing it, well, now, you're not guessing as well. There's a lot of guessing that goes on within a football game from the coaching staffs. And if you're not guessing correctly, all of a sudden the job of the offensive line probably gets a little bit easier. Perhaps that's the case. Hope so. Brian Jordan says that Missouri and Oklahoma just don't look like top 15 teams. Yeah, I think the Missouri thing is probably real. They are skating by against pretty less than competition here right now. I think they've got some losses coming, and I think their sort of status as a preseason top 10 team, I think they'll be long forgotten by the time we get to the end of the season. I think you're probably right about that. Oklahoma maybe too, but Oklahoma's also out of the top 15 now. They're sort of bottom part of the top 25, and they may fall out of that too. But clearly Missouri is a team that at one point in time was as high as, number 7 in the country. Probably not quite meeting that ranking here right now. Lesko says Kirby owes Saban everything. He doesn't owe DeBoer anything. I want Kirby to go out there and disrespect DeBoer and give him a proper welcome to the SEC. Yeah, I think that's very fair. And look, DeBoer is a good coach. He wouldn't have gotten the Alabama job if he wasn't. But the one thing we don't quite yet know is can he be an SEC-style coach? And sometimes outsiders come in here, like Urban Meyer, and they adapt to the personality of this league very well. Other time, guys like, say, Brian Harsin, probably not as accomplished of a resume, they come down here and they get swallowed up right away. And, go back to when Kirby Smart was a rookie head coach back in 2016. This is what a lot of us were looking at for Kirby. For a guy who had never been a head coach before, absolute total failure was at least a possibility on like the Bayes theorem array of all the possible outcomes. For a guy who had never coached a game before, you at least had to consider the possibility he was a total failure, because some coaches are. Look at all the people that Florida's hired. So the first thing for Kirby to prove was, and he did prove this, even though Georgia didn't have a great season, he proved that he wasn't overwhelmed by the moment. He wasn't beneath the standard of the job, whether it be through his recruiting or his just demeanor or those brief glimpses of success, beating a top 10 ranked Auburn team, for instance. Kirby sort of showed you that he was not smaller than the job, that he could be the guy in the job. Then after that, he started having the kind of success. It's sort of a be-do-have thing. He showed you that he could be the coach of Georgia, and then he started doing and having the things that a Georgia coach would have. For Kalen DeBoer, there's a little bit of a version of that too, that I don't believe this is going to happen on Saturday, but there's at least some chance he just falls completely flat. Like, we would assume that Georgia's not going to completely fall flat in a game like this, but there's at least some chance that DeBoer is just overwhelmed by the moment, because some coaches are. I don't believe it'll be him. He's won enough in his lifetime, including being in the playoff last year. But listen, marching through a lame duck league in the final year of its existence and beating a team like Texas, who was also sort of a newcomer to that party, that's not the same thing as he's going to be asked to do on Saturday. It's just a very different set of circumstances. It is. And as the commenter mentioned, we're going to find out if he's equal and up to that task coming up on Saturday. Good comments today. Steven says, if we dominate the line of scrimmage, we win easily. I think that's right. And I don't think that's going to be easy. I really don't. Like, I'm not like they are. Their people go on their media stuff, and they tell their people that, like the dude we played yesterday, like his worst-case scenario was Alabama only scores 35 points. That was his worst-case scenario. Y'all, I would never treat you that way. I've got too much respect for you. You all are smarter than that. That's not the worst-case scenario for Georgia in this game. The worst-case scenario is that Alabama's lines of scrimmage do prove to be formidable. They are getting healthier along the offensive line. They still got guys on the defensive line. I don't know how well Kalen DeBoer will kind of bring in his own linemen in the future, but for now, he's inherited the offensive and defensive lines that Saban populated, and that's probably enough to be pretty good. So I think Steven is right. In one form or fashion, Georgia will, need to win on the lines of scrimmage, and against Alabama, that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. I'm getting criticism on the Dog Nation side of things just because I've been on other comment sections. Scott Harris says the line of scrimmage is going to be tough on Saturday. Yeah, I mean, it's where the battle's going to be fought. And it's one of those areas in which Georgia probably needs to be better. And being healthier along the defensive line gives you a chance at that. Obviously, on the offensive side, you got to try to absorb the loss of Tate Ratledge. But it's also a group that just needs to play better, probably. I think that's probably fair. Randy Hall mentioning Jackson Arnold's been demoted. We talked about that a little earlier. They played the freshman last week. Now they're going to start him. To me, that seems like a really quick trigger, but I'm also not in Norman, so I can't say for sure. DT also mentioning that when you go back to Kirby's original press conference to get the Georgia job, he talked about wanting to have more depth and be larger on those lines of scrimmage. That's exactly right. Yard Dog says, do we spy Milroe and who with? It's important to remember, Yard, that last year Georgia had like twin spies on Milroe, essentially putting two guys and watching him the entirety of the time. I'm not an X's O's expert. I won't pretend to be, but my fear and concern about anything like that is it just sort of seems like, certainly when you spy him with two guys, the way that Georgia did for a lot last year, you're almost playing defense with 9 at that point. So, and it also becomes really, really hard to generate any pass rush at all. So I guess you probably have to. Georgia's sort of done that in a lot of ways over the years. I remember there was one game going back in I don't think they'll do this on Saturday. There's one game back in 2021 where it almost seemed like they were spying a quarterback with Devontae Wyatt. They've had, which is not typically what you would expect, a defense to do. But obviously finding a way to keep him contained without sacrificing your opportunity to rush the passer, that's going to be a huge part of the game on Saturday. PDT, also on the subject of the Braves. Yeah, big series for the Braves starts tonight. We're obviously a college football show, so we don't get as much time to talk about stuff like this, but I am heavily interested in one final shot here, down a couple of games against the Mets, trying to make something happen here with that. It's late season. It's during the week. It's also a year in which, Atlanta's kind of been through a lot. You kind of wonder what the crowd response is going to be. I know tonight, I believe they're giving away the City Connect replica jerseys. So I'm hoping they get the big crowd. Fan attendance has been great for the Braves now for a while. But I don't know what kind of crowds they get here this week. I hope they're really good crowds, even though it's kind of a tricky time. DT says, how do you view Kirby's presser non-answer about meaning of the Alabama game to him? He says, I love Kirby lives by the mantra a friend taught me. He says, don't complain and don't explain. Yeah, I think there is some of that. I do think that Kirby views it that he doesn't really owe anybody too much of the inner workings of his mind. I do believe that Kirby's a thoughtful person, and I do believe that Kirby – I think that there's probably an understanding of the meaning of these type of games, sometimes maybe more than Kirby lets on, but he does choose to keep that with himself. And to be honest with you, I think he's well within his rights to do that. In other words, I've never really needed anything from Kirby. He can say a lot, he can say a little. We still have plenty to talk about no matter what, because I'm sort of the motor mouth. So I'm always going to have plenty to say. It's certainly his prerogative to choose how much he wants to or not want to talk about situations like this. But, the old thing that Kirby said prior to the Florida game in 2017 about doing our talking with our helmets, Kirby, I think, takes that to heart, even when it comes to his own belief about certain games. He's just content to let the game speak for itself. And By the way, that's also a twin-edged sword because I think that Georgia fans are all about that going into a game like this. Don't give them anything. I think that sometimes when Georgia loses a game, I think there's a lot of Georgia fans that want a little bit more from Kirby of, hey, man, tell me what's happening here. And at that point in time, Kirby is still the same way. He's the kind of guy that doesn't choose to explain a whole lot or sort of pretends that there's nothing to explain. I think that's probably true. So sometimes fans like it when Kirby keeps it very close to the vest, and sometimes they kind of don't. But Kirby is going to be the way he's going to be no matter what. Yard Dog, yeah, this was an awesome one. I think this is what he's talking about. So the day that Paul Johnson's coaching career probably came to an end, once again, I am not an X's and O's expert. There's a lot of things that happen on the football field that I am not going to diagnose correctly. But this was fascinating. Do y'all remember this? And I believe this is what Yard Dog's talking about. So one of the things that the triple option from Tech was sort of predicated on is like getting the guard through, pulling the guard around on a running play, going into the hole, meeting the linebacker, then the option would follow behind that guard, and that's how the inside handoff worked in an option play. And it's one of those deals where if you're running the option quickly, your guard does not have to be, Steve Hutchinson. Like, as long as he made good contact and you were running the option in rhythm, just a little bit of contact and the running back kind of slipping behind that was enough. Like, you didn't have to maul somebody to win in a situation like that. You just had to complete the block because all it took was like a little bit of a fraction of a second for the back to slip behind, and now it's a positive gain, and it could turn into more than that. So Georgia did this thing, and maybe somebody else has done this before too, but obviously I'm just watching Georgia more closely. I believe it was Natrez Patrick, right? So I'm right about this, right? Like, Natrez Patrick would step up on that play, and they'd stack the two inside linebackers. And so Natrez Patrick would essentially block the guard from blocking, like, say, Roquan, and then Roquan would come right behind and make the play. And maybe in 2018 with somebody else. But it was like the most fascinating, like, diagnosis of the option you'll ever see of stack the linebackers. The guard's looking for the linebacker, but in this particular case, the linebacker's looking for the guard. You meet him in the hole, other linebacker slips right behind you and goes and tackles the running back. It was one of those cool football things because it was actually fairly easy to see, whereas like a lot of football stuff sort of happens in the fog of war. This was like a little bit easy to see, which was kind of fun. Dennis B says the forecast Wednesday through Friday for the Braves area is 78% chance of rain, 100% on Thursday, 99% on Friday. So, yeah, that's pretty rough. That's pretty rough. Yard Dog says Roquan never let him get across the line of scrimmage. It was absolute domination, and it totally was. It totally was. All right, a couple of final comments, and we're going to bounce out of here for today. Scotty Barnes says, burn the boats, lock the doors. Them dogs are going elephant hunting. I love that, man. I love that. You are right, Scotty, indeed. Winfred Steinspring says, Kirby or any coach. Let me get this from him. Winfred saying Kirby or any coach has to open their mouth because the media, just like in politics, spin every single word. Yeah, there's probably some truth to that. Obviously, we're always looking to see. We take a 20-minute press conference and we look for the most interesting thing. We do. I'll listen to a player press conference, and most of the time we don't play anything from those because the player has avoided saying something that's even a little bit interesting. But if we find something interesting, we're going to bring it to all of you because that's sort of what we do. We just sort of, curate the most interesting things moving into a game week. And coaches, it's not so much I believe they see interesting as bad. They just don't think they have anything to gain from it, so why risk it? I think that's what it's more about than anything. It probably is to a degree, like, the politics thing. Probably a little bit like that. Johnny Prescott says Ryan Williams seems like another one of those Bama receivers that could hit us for some explosive plays. Yeah, he's really good, man. He's young, too. I know everybody makes a big deal about him only being 17, but that's still pretty wild. I guess Joseph Jonah-Janye is also only 17. At least I think he's still only 17. But, yeah, Ryan Williams looks like one of these Alabama receivers that they've had before. He does. He does, for sure. Kyle Cummings predicts KJ Bolden to get 2 sacks. That would be fun. Boy, I'd love that, man. I'd love that. I love that. Jennifer Stevenson Fleming says that Williams hasn't seen a defense like what Georgia's going to bring in. I mean, I hope that's the case too. A big moment for a good secondary. Lynn Shipman says, I just have to say this when it comes to officiating, that Tyler Simmons is still on sides. Lynn, I love that. One of the great shibboleths for Georgia fans for many years to come, probably. Al Chandler says, do we see any trick plays from either team? I don't know. Here's one thing I'll tell you. I'm weird about this, and I'm not saying anybody else should be like this. I've never liked trick plays. I know that makes me seem like the least fun person in the world. I've never liked trick plays. I don't like halfback option passes. I don't like double reverses. I don't like any of that kind of stuff. I just like regular football plays. Now, there have been some fun plays for Georgia, like Dylan Bell last year threw a touchdown against Tennessee. Kenny McIntosh threw a touchdown against Michigan. So there's obviously some really fun stuff that happens sometimes when it comes to trick plays. But like the old Philly special that was popular a few years ago, I know this makes me sound like the dullest, lamest dude in the world, but I don't like trick plays. I like regular football plays. But obviously, and listen, as I'm gonna be tied in knots on Saturday. Like the last thing I want to say is Georgia trying some crazy thing. But if it worked, I guess I'd be happy about it. Matt Rukavina says the Orange Bowl touchdown pass from Kenny McIntosh was fantastic, and it was. It was. Jacob O'Neill says Lane Kiffin likes trick plays. Yeah. I'd say that Lane Kiffin and I probably have a lot of differences in life. DT also kind of making fun of the fact that people have made a very big deal about Ryan Williams only being 17. Savannah Bryan also brings up a good point. Savannah Bryan, like we talk about Kirby sometimes not saying, at least from the perspective of some, maybe not quite saying enough, but from a perspective of a Georgia fan, way better that than someone like Hugh Freeze who just literally says too much. Like I told y'all before, I probably tolerate Freeze more so than some of y'all do. His statements are actively making things worse. I think that Brian brings up a great point here on this, is that if he'd just keep his mouth shut, I think everything would be fine at Auburn, even if they are terrible this year. If he'd just keep his mouth shut, they'd get through it. But he can't shut up. And I swear, like, to go back to what I think it was DT said earlier, sometimes, like, not caring what people think about you is a good thing. It's almost like a superpower sometimes. But it's one thing not to care what people say about you. It's another thing not to really be aware of criticism that exists of you. And like Hugh Freeze kind of comes across to me as like the least self-aware, least media-savvy coach in the world. The whole thing about we'd beat Arkansas 9 more times, like even Auburn fans hate that. This isn't like, Homer Georgia show ripping the UGA rival. The Auburn people are beside themselves about that. They think that kind of stuff is so dumb. So dumb. All right, back on YouTube, then we're going to go. Frank Patterson says that Alabama's got no one that can cover Arian Smith. Boy, if Smith had the big day, I mean, I've told y'all before, one of my favorite plays of this era for Georgia football is the Arian touchdown against Ohio State. Boy, I'd love that. That'd be so much fun. Yeah, and as I think we've got, a conversation ongoing over here, obviously it's a big day for the Georgia secondary. Big day in the Georgia secondary. Someone named Jay Daw says that Bama wins by more than 14. Well, listen, Jay, if you're an Alabama fan, that sounds like you've got nothing to worry about, so enjoy the day. It sounds like you've got nothing to worry about. Cody Strickland says DJ Lagway to Georgia next year. You want to talk about that would be wild. That would be wild. Cody, that's pretty wild. Jalen Jackson says, well, we may make this our last comment for today. He says, expect to see heavy pressure on defense. Expect to see Malachi and KJ playing two deep majority of the game. Offense, expect to see accommodation routes to confuse young secondary for Bama. You could be right about that, Jalen. Let me give you one more thing, too, in addition to what you're saying. So I thought that Connor brought up a pretty good point, which is that, and Kirby talked about this yesterday, too, which is Georgia is more experienced at inside linebacker than it was a year ago. Healthier, but also more experienced. Raylan Wilson's just a better player now than he was. And I think a lot of people are aware that Raylan did not have a great moment against Alabama last year. I think that my understanding is that Georgia had been preparing him for that all week long. And in the spot, maybe he just sort of froze up. That sometimes that just sort of happens, right? Freshman player in a tough spot. Alabama picked on him. They got him on that one touchdown. And sometimes in football, that just happens. You dust yourself off, you go right back to work. And that's what Raylan Wilson did. He's a player right now. Now, let's think about this for a moment. In 2021, and we're going to do this, we're going to finish up. In 2021, when Georgia got pass pressure, oftentimes, where did it come from? Where did the pass rush come from? You know, like Trayvon Walker, who was the number 1 overall pick, did not have huge numbers that year. Let's look and see who did. In 2021, Robert Beal led the team with 6.5 sacks, but Nakobe Dean had 6. Now, Trayvon Walker did have 6 himself, but Channing Tindall had 5.5. Quay Walker had a sack and a half. In other words, think about, now this was a Dan Lanning-led defense, I know that, but think about how often you saw Georgia bringing pass pressure up the middle with these inside linebackers. For whatever reason, that was just kind of a big hallmark of what Georgia did in 2021. To my eyes, they probably didn't do as much of that last year, maybe, at least to my eyes. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I often am. But if it's going to be a big day for the Georgia pass rush, we talked about Jalen Walker, you know, hybrid player. What if a lot of that's coming up the middle? For whatever reason, that's been a place where Georgia's been successful before. So watch the inside linebackers, not just like spying Milroe or whatever else, but actually getting involved in the game, and maybe they're the source of some of those negative plays, because it just seems like when Georgia's been at its best, some of the stuff coming up the middle was a big part of that. That's what I'm thinking about. All right. Let's get ready to go. Good stuff. Y'all find RS Andrews online at rsandrews.com for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. When you think about plumbing emergencies, I want you to think about RS Andrews, because the fact of the matter is, you know, your pipes are hidden behind your wall, so therefore you don't really think about them at all. But if something in your house stops working, or if some sort of like explosion happens or something like that, water's going everywhere, well, now you are thinking about plumbing for maybe the first time. So if something like that cues you, oh gosh, I've got a problem when it comes to my plumbing, water heater goes out, pipes aren't working, whatever, I want you to think about RS Andrews as the emergency call to get that plumbing emergency taken care of right away. In many cases, they'll do it for you, boom, right there the same day. So find them online at rsandrews.com. That is rsandrews.com. All right, y'all have a great day. We will see you back here tomorrow. RS Andrews Cool Down when it's all said and done. DawgNation Daily presented by ServPro. Prior to that, Davin Bellamy's here tomorrow. That'll be fun. We will see you then. DawgNation Daily presented by ServPro. Have a great day.